It's time for us to begin. It's actually past time. Preacher was a little long-winded this morning. Was it? Who made that sound? It was her? I knew where it came from. Oh, goodness. We are in Luke chapter 16. Now, I want to tell you how much I love and appreciate Andy Clemmer. He's going to take over this class next week. I talked to him this morning. I said, now, I'm sure we won't finish chapter 16 today. I said, but if you want me to do another week and finish chapter 16, I will, or whatever you want to do. And he said, I'll do it. And I said, okay. So you only got today to put up with me, and then you get a break for a quarter, and then I'll come back. But we're studying the Luke-Acts narratives. The Gospel of Luke, of course, the Acts of the Apostles. Luke being the author of both of these books and being a continuation, Acts being really a continuation of Luke, and we'll see that when we get into Acts chapter 1. But this morning we want to begin chapter 16 with what I believe to be, for the most part, one of the most difficult parables that Jesus ever taught. And this is one of those parables that I've struggled with over the years. And so let's talk about it this morning and see if we can ascertain what the Lord is trying to get across to us here. Now, I'll just tell you up front, I really believe, and y'all have heard me talk about this, to understand any particular parable or narrative or teaching, you have to understand the context within what it was said, right? You got to know who's speaking, who they're speaking to, and what is the overall theme? What is being addressed here? Now, whatever this parable means, I believe it has to do with our stewardship. Because that's the focus of this. The slide says the shrewd manager, the parable of the shrewd manager. Jesus tells the parable of the shrewd manager is the head of, the heading in my study Bible here. But let's make sure that we understand who he's talking to first. Now, we mentioned this back in chapter 15. So, we said in chapter 15 you have the parable of the lost sheep, the parable of the lost coin, and then the parable of the lost son, the prodigal son. The young preacher that I was talking to the other day, he said, I hate that title for that. He said he calls it the parable of the lost sons. Because, and we mentioned this at the beginning of the class, of that study of chapter 15. Who's Jesus speaking to in chapter 15? Is he speaking only to one group? He's not just speaking to the scribes and Pharisees. He's also not just speaking to the publicans and sinners. He's speaking to both groups. He has a message for both hearers, right? To the publicans and sinners, he's trying to help them understand their value. He's trying to help them understand God's love for them. He's trying to help them understand the idea of redemption and forgiveness and grace and mercy, right? But to the scribes and Pharisees, he's trying to get them to see the other side of that coin. How hypocritical they are. How lost they truly are. Like the older son, right? And how they have been blessed with so much. Everything. What did the father tell the older son? When the older son is complaining about not getting a feast with his friends, what does the father tell him? All that I have is thine. It's always been yours. And what's he telling the scribes and Pharisees? You have always been my people. And now you're upset because your younger brother has come home? So he's talking to both groups. I think the same thing is true in chapter 16. And again, Andy, did you hear the compliment I paid you earlier? Oh, okay, never mind that. How grateful I was that you were taking over this class next week, and how thankful they may be as well. We'll see. That's what we'll see. In both of these parables in chapter 16, he's still talking to both groups of people. Okay? In verse 1, he was saying also to his disciples. Now, if we just look at that and we don't look at the context and everything else it said, we'll miss this. But in verse 14, look at verse 14. Now the Pharisees, who were lovers of money, were listening. Does Jesus have something to say to them as well? Well, sure he does. So these parables, and this is true with the rich man and Lazarus, and Andy will talk about that next week. Both of these parables, he's got something to say to both groups. So, let's look at the parable. He was also saying to his disciples, there was a rich man who had a manager or steward. And this steward, manager, was this one, technically the Greek says this person, this one, was reported to him as squandering his possessions. Now, the report here, the word that's used for it was made known to him, it was reported to him, is that there were charges brought against him with hostile intent. Somebody was upset with what this steward or manager was doing with his master's finances. And charges were brought against him that would relieve him of his position. Okay? And so, verse 2, the master calls him and says to him, what is this I hear about you? Give an account of your management, for you can no longer be steward or manager. Now, what did he do? Well, we don't know. And that's really not important, I guess, in the overall understanding of this parable. But it doesn't necessarily mean that he was stealing from him. In fact, I think it's more likely from the language that he just was being negligent. Does that make sense? And I think that's borne out in what he does after here. Okay? So, he's in charge of all the master's money. He's in charge of the accounting. He's in charge of... My son-in-law works for a company in Cincinnati, Ohio. It's a factory supply. It's called Factory Supply. And his job is, he is the head of accounting for their receivings. So he makes sure that the bills get sent out and they get paid, all that, right? That's kind of what this guy's doing, right? He's supposed to be making sure that his master, his boss, is getting paid what he's owed. But apparently, he's not been doing his job. Okay? So the manager says, what is this that you're doing, that I hear about you? Give an account of your management. The manager said to himself. So the idea is that your day is not... So when he says, there in verse 2, give an account, for you can no longer be a manager, it wasn't like pack your stuff and get out of the office. You need to sit down and show me the books. Let me see everything. Well, that's going to take some time, right? And so in this process, he says to himself, what am I going to do? I'm paraphrasing, but what am I going to do? My master is taking my job away from me. And he says, I'm not strong enough to dig, and to beg I am ashamed. What do you think about that? Any thoughts or just on what he says here? I'm not strong enough to dig, and I'm ashamed to beg. Verse 4 says, I know. And the way it's worded here, it's almost like he's given this a lot of thought, and he's come up with a plan. Okay, here's what I know now I'm going to do. Okay? It's not just like the light bulb went off and he goes, aha, this is what I'll do. No, he's given this some real thought. Okay? This is what I'll do. So that when I'm removed from the management, people will welcome me into their homes. So he summons, and let's back up here for a second. Also with this idea of giving an account of your management, the idea here, I'm the manager, I'm the accountant, I've been negligent in my duties. Bill's going to take over. He's going to be the new manager. Well, I've got to hand the books all over to him. And he's got to be able to see where all the money is, and so that's what this guy's doing, right? He's going to turn everything over to the next guy. So he says, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go out and summon each one of his master's debtors. And he began saying to the first, how much do you owe my master? He said, verse 6, 100 measures of oil. He said to him, take your bill, sit down quickly and write 50. Then he said to another, how much do you owe? And he said, 100 measures of wheat. He said to him, take your bill and write 80. And his master praised the unrighteous manager because he had acted shrewdly. Now let's stop there. Because there's some question about, is that where the parable stops, or did it stop before that or after this? I don't know. But let's stop there for a second. What do you think about what he does here? It's the parable of the shrewd manager. Because Jesus goes on to say here, the sons of this age are more shrewd in relation to their own kind than the sons of light. So what do we think about what this guy does, his plan? What do you think of the master's response? And I can stand here all day and wait for you because Andy's teaching next week. Okay. Okay.
So you forgive it to get them back in good standing, so then you can get your normal flow going back again. It's worth it in the long run.
I think there absolutely is a sense of that here. It's almost a sense of, well, we need to cut our losses here and get something back, right? Because right now, the master's out 100 measures of wheat, right, and 100 measures of oil. At least he's going to get something back.
Better to get half than nothing.
Better to get half than nothing, right? Is that why he praises him? Now, I don't think, so here's the question. Anybody else have anything else to say about that? I started to say too much too soon and everybody shut up. Yeah. That's right. Well, if somebody comes to you and says, okay, I know you owe me $1,000, but I'll take 800 and we're calling it even. Right. But he's still acting. So that's the idea here with the manager is, and maybe I missed that earlier, this steward, this manager, is acting under the authority of the master. It's like he has power of attorney to act on his behalf. He is a legal representation of the manager or the master. Yes.
I mean, I kind of view this as not like money, well, Marine Corps lens, like you get a lot of responsibility to manage maintenance programs, make sure people are doing their jobs.
Yeah.
The master probably knows exactly what's going on with the account, and it's like, all right, it's time for you to, you're going to give me a report of what's going on.
Sure.
Well, my job, the same thing happens where it's like, all right, so you need to give me a report because I know you're not doing your job.
Right.
But I might praise them once they finally figure it out and start doing it. It's like, good job. You actually started doing what you should do, and I don't have to correct you anymore. Or maybe you should keep doing this in the future kind of thing.
Yeah, I don't know. And so there are a couple of different ways to look at the master's response here, is what you're saying. Yes. Yeah. That's a great point, because we need to come back to that, because that's part of the overall message of this parable, is that he is acting wisely on his own behalf, not just for the master. He's looking out for number one. He's looking out for himself. That's where the difficulty in understanding this parable and how it ends lies. Okay, and we'll get back to that in a minute. But you're right, and thank you for bringing that up. He is spreading the wealth. He's making friends so that he's going to be okay no matter what happens. But he's going to lose his job anyway, and he knows that. He knows that. And I think that's part of the praise here. I don't think he gets his job back. And I'm not sure that the master even praises him to his face or whatever. It may just be that the master goes, you know what? He's a smart guy. That was a good move. You know?
The master, too, he's got bills to pay. And
so, well, yeah, absolutely.
The master can't pay his own debt, so here, because he's not collecting anything.
Well, and my only other thought with that, though, Clint, is when I'm out of office and Bill takes over, would Bill have gotten the full amount?
On a personal point, if a company gives me that much credit, I'm going to continue to do business with them. So
Yes.
I'm coming back. So maybe that is why the Lord praised him, because it's going to be a continual relationship there.
Right. He acted wisely for everybody's sake, right? If he had acted that wisely in the first place, he'd still have his job, right? But you're right, absolutely. All right, so anything else? So, verse 8 again, his master praised the unrighteous manager because he had acted wisely, shrewdly. For the sons of this age are more shrewd in relation to their own kind than the sons of light. Whatever this parable means, I think it hinges on this part of the parable. What does he mean then? When Jesus says, the sons, all right, so let's break it down, let's parse it out. Who are the sons of this age? All right, so let's go back. Who's he talking to here? He's talking to both, but primarily here he's talking to, so in this, yeah, he's got a message for both of them, what I said earlier, but he's talking to the disciples, but the scribes and Pharisees are listening, right? So Jesus being the master teacher, they're all going to learn something here. He got something for all of them, but he's talking to the disciples. So when he says the sons of this age, who's he talking about? He's not talking about the disciples. He's talking about those that are listening over here. He's talking about the scribes and Pharisees over here. All right? He says to it, so it's like he's looking at his disciples and he's saying, you see these guys over here? They're wiser in the way they deal with their own kind, with their people, than you are. They're wiser. They're more shrewd in their relation with their own kind than the sons of light. Who are the sons of light? His disciples. So what's he talking about? And I think here's what he's talking about. Well, should I just tell you what I think, or you want to tell me what you think? You want to hear mine first? Come on, Dale. Yeah, then you can pick it apart. That sounds like a great plan. What did his disciples expect? Earthly messiahship, earthly kingdom. What did James and John and their mother ask of Jesus at some point? One to sit on his right hand, one on his left. What's Jesus' intent? My kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight. And were they willing to fight? Absolutely. He's talking about the end of days here. The scribes and the Pharisees were wrapped up in earthly things. Okay? Now he's going to come back in verse 9 and he's going to talk about this unrighteous mammon, this unrighteous wealth. Right? What they were placing their trust in. Where did the scribes and Pharisees, where did people of the world put their trust? In worldly things, in riches. Right? That's where they're putting their faith. That's where they're putting their trust. And he says when it comes to them in this life, they're wiser, they're shrewder in their relationships about possessions, about money. Just like this steward, right? They're wiser and more shrewd about that than y'all are about the kingdom and eternal life. Yes. Me too.
And I don't know if I can put it in words that's going through my head, but I'll try it. I think it kind of hinges back to, I keep going back to verse 4.
Yes. Yep.
I don't get the head out of it.
That's okay.
It almost, he wasn't being commended because of the shrewdness of his actions. But I think it goes back to maybe the spiritual aspect that this unjust steward, this manager, he was willing to sacrifice something on earth for his future gain.
Yes.
For his future gain.
That's a great way to put it.
And I think the point that maybe he's trying to get here is we have to be willing to sacrifice the material things of this earth for our heavenly future.
I think that's exactly what he's getting at. I think that's exactly what he's getting at. Because he says here,
Those earthly sons are willing to do that, but the sons of light
are they going to be as...
already loved to let go of this earthly gain.
That's right. That's right. Verse 9. I say to you, make friends for yourselves by... And I like the way the New American Standard says this. Make friends for yourself by means of the wealth of unrighteousness. He doesn't tell them to put their faith and trust in that stuff, but to make friends or to do wise things, to, just like this shrewd manager made friends with how he handled the money so that he would be taken care of, he's telling his disciples, be good stewards of what you have here so that you will inherit eternal life. And I think that's what he's saying. Notice he says, so that when it fails, what's going to fail? Worldly things. Money, it will fail. Gold, silver, our economy. Well, there it goes. Anyway, right? It's all going to end. And what's left? So that they will receive you into, that is the friends that they make, the good decisions that they make, the trust that and where they put it, that they will be received into eternal dwellings. Does that make sense? Sid, do you have a thought? I thought I saw you raise your hand.
This steward
Yes.
Benefited others, and he benefited himself.
Correct.
I think there's a lesson there for us in the kingdom that we benefit the manager or the God.
Yep.
We serve the kingdom, we serve others,
Yep.
but we get something out of it too.
Absolutely. And so this goes back to, sorry to cut you off there.
That's it.
We talked about this Wednesday night. And I've said this before, for those of you who haven't heard it, it's new, but the rest of you have all heard this. What is the greatest command? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Second command is likened to the first, love your neighbor. All right. God first, other second. That's it. Put God first, put other second. And when you are a wise steward of what God has blessed you with, to serve God and serve others, what you're really doing in the long run is benefiting yourself. And I think that's exactly what this parable is trying to say. Okay? Let's keep reading here.
Well, what Jesus says about laying nothing up for yourselves,
Yes.
riches on earth,
But treasures in heaven, right?
correct use of what God gives us. And for me, I've always struggled with this parable,
Yeah, oh, absolutely.
right down through verse 9.
Yep.
I
Well,
think verse 9 is the kicker.
it is. I think that's right. But notice the context as we continue on, verse 10. He's not done teaching. Yeah, the parable itself is over, but now, so what, and a lot of times this is true with Jesus, once the parable is ended, what happens? Well, Jesus got to go back and explain the parable. He's got to give some sense of the meaning. That's what good preachers are supposed to do. They're supposed to, this is what God says, and this is what it means, and this is how we apply it to our lives. Right? And so Jesus says in verse 10, he who is faithful in a very little thing is faithful also in much. What he's saying here is, whatever God has blessed you with, if it's 5 talents, 10 talents, 2 talents, 5 talents, 1 talent, whatever, right? If you only got 1, somebody else got 10. Be a wise steward with the little you got. Because he that is faithful over a little will also be faithful over much. And he who is unrighteous in a very little thing is unrighteous also in much. Is there a small work when it comes to the Lord? No. And that's what he's trying to get across, right, Tim? You may think it's a small work. But in God's eyes, every work is a great work if it's done for him, right? Therefore, if you have not been faithful in the use of unrighteous wealth and unrighteous mammon, who will entrust you with true riches? And if you have not been faithful, he's still talking to his disciples. If you have not been faithful in the use of that which is another's, what do we have? Everything we have, where did we get it? Where did it come from? Everything I have because of God, right? We need to acknowledge that. It's another's. It belongs to someone else. It belongs to him. Who will give you that which is your own? Because no servant can serve 2 masters. Either you will love the one and hate the other, or be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and mammon. Now, how many times have we quoted Luke 16:13, but not put it in the context of this parable? That helps us, Richard, understand what this parable is saying, right? So now the Pharisees, who were lovers of money, were listening to all of these things, and they were what? What? Scoffing? Does somebody's text say something other than scoffing? Does it translate a different way? I'm sorry? Okay. Ridicule? Yeah. It's almost like, how do I put this? So they're all standing over there and they hear Jesus say this and they all go, right? I mean, Yeah.
Sit and listen and try to make an argument of what you have to say.
And that's what they're doing. Absolutely. He says to them, so now he turns his attention away from the disciples to those who are listening over here who are now going, well, whatever. And he turns and he looks at them. This is one of those times where I think, you really got to put yourself in the picture and imagine you're sitting there among the scribes and Pharisees and you hear this and you're like, yeah, whatever. And then Jesus turns and looks at you and says, you are those who justify yourselves in the sight of men, but God knows your hearts. For that which is highly esteemed among men is detestable in the sight of God. The law and the prophets were proclaimed until John. Since then, the gospel of the kingdom of God has been preached, and everyone is forcing his way into it, which I don't like that translation, New American Standard. And I'll tell you why here in a second. But again, context. Forget the verse number 16. It's bolded in mine because it begins a new paragraph. But this is still all part of the same context. And to understand the parable, this helps, right? Because what's he talking about? He's talking about the gospel of the kingdom. Inheriting eternal life. And the sons who are being pressed into it. And that's really, in the Greek language, this is passive. It's in the passive tense. It's something that's being done to them. The gospel is compelling them, pressing them. It's the gospel that's doing it. The gospel is what saves us. The good news of the kingdom of God is what saves us, right? And it's pressing them into the kingdom. But it is easier for heaven and earth to pass away than for one stroke of a letter or of the law to fail. Now, Matthew 5 and 18, Matthew records Jesus as saying, is it possible until all be fulfilled? But that's inherent in the teaching. The law was until John. From John on, the gospel is being preached. And what he's saying there in verse 17 is, and Paul says this in Ephesians again, and there's a couple other times it's alluded to, that the old law is being fulfilled in what Christ is teaching and doing. And that's what he's getting at here. The old law was until John. Since then, the gospel is being preached, and the old law is being fulfilled. Okay? And then he says, and this sounds kind of completely out of place. So I really thought about stopping here and letting Andy deal with this next week. But I won't do that to you. Verse 18. Everyone who divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery. And he who marries one who is divorced from her husband commits adultery. Now, I don't think this is here by accident. I don't think Luke just decided to throw this in at the last minute. Oh, yeah, by the way, Jesus also said this. Let me write that down. This has something to do with the context. Tell me that was the second bell. Okay. I was trying to dump it on you, Andy. So what's this got to do with the overall context that we're talking about? Okay. That's one of the two things I came up with. One is, and again, Paul does this in 1 Corinthians. He's contrasting the old law and the new law, and the old law being put away with the husband and wife and the marriage, and that a wife is bound to her husband, Romans, a wife is bound to her husband so long as the husband lives, but the husband be dead and she's married to another, she's no longer called an adulteress because her husband is dead. So there's this correlation between the marriage relationship and the old law, new law. Theologically, that's what that means. Personally, in application, what do you think it means here?
In the context of people hearing it,
Yes.
wouldn't Jewish people who the Pharisees represent, wouldn't they, I mean, the church is the bride of Christ.
Yeah, sure.
So, I mean, they're kind of the parallel of God's people up until the gospel. So are they kind of
Yeah, I see what you're saying. I think that kind of goes in the same thing that Dale's saying here. It's kind of that same context. I think what the other thing is here, and I'll leave it with this and we'll end class. What was the debate that the early... What was the debate in the first century among the scribes and Pharisees about divorce and remarriage? Anybody remember?
Yeah, over whether not to put your wife away for any reason.
Right.
Sexually unfaithful.
Right. So you've got the school of Hillel and the school of Shammai. One teaches that you can put your wife away. You know, she burns the biscuit, you fed up with her, get out, marry somebody else. I mean, we take our biscuits seriously. I mean, you know, I understand. Versus the other school that says no, only for sexual infidelity. Now, Jesus won't get wrapped up in their argument. Jesus goes back to the beginning and say, from the beginning, God's intent was what? One man, one woman for life. Not two men, not two women, one man, one woman for life. Now, Jesus gives an exception to that, right? For the unfaithfulness of the spouse, one can be put away. Does God hate divorce? Yeah, you know, there's a lot of discussion about that verse in Malachi chapter 2. Is it really God who hates divorce, or is it the man who hates his wife and divorces her and God doesn't like that? The attitude. Different translations will translate it different ways. We don't have time to get into that this morning. But that being said, is divorce always wrong? No. In fact, Jeremiah 3 verse 8 says God divorced Israel. God wouldn't sin. But why did God divorce Israel? Because Israel had committed spiritual adultery by going after other gods. Right? And I think what this means here, I think he's still talking to the scribes and Pharisees. And he's saying, y'all want to have things your way. You want to be able to get rid of your wife and have another wife because this one's not good enough, and you always want something better, and you're always putting your faith and your trust and everything into this world. And he's telling them, and in the same vein, now he's talking to them, but he's hoping the disciples are listening. Right? Don't put your faith and trust in this world, in the things and pleasures of life of this world. What happened to Solomon? What's Ecclesiastes all about? This world will not satisfy you. Nothing in this world will satisfy you. Nothing's ever going to be good enough. Put your faith and trust in God. This is the whole of man. Fear God, keep his commandments. Ecclesiastes 12:13. I think that's why he includes that here. He's talking to them about their attitudes, about worldly things and pleasures in this life versus eternal things, spiritual things. I'm waiting for that bell to ring. There we go. All right. Thank you all so much. Good discussion. Be here to support Andy next week. I almost said he'll need it. He won't.